Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 27 in my ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. As I say at the beginning of every episode, it's always my intent, to the extent possible, for each episode to stand on its own. However, it is a series, and for those of you who want the full context of this story, those earlier episodes are available to go back and listen to in the same place you found this one. Last week, I gave an overview of the political developments in Afghanistan during the 1970s, which ultimately culminated in the Soviet invasion of December 1979, the start of the Soviet-Afghan War. This week, I will zoom in and take a closer look at how that war was experienced by the Soviet people. My focus in this episode will primarily be on the experiences of the Red Army soldiers who fought in Afghanistan, but I will also try to address how the war was perceived and experienced by civilians in the Soviet Union as well. This is The End of History, Part 27. I've talked before on this podcast about my love of movies. When it's made well, a film can be both entertaining and thought-provoking. Most films, as they age, will become irrelevant, unrelatable, and unable to compare to the special effects and visual qualities of movies being made in Hollywood today. But the very best movies are timeless. They stand the test of time because of the quality of the story, the relatability of the dialogue, and most importantly because they capture the spirit of the time in which they were made. If a movie is really made well, it's not going to matter that the special effects are crude or hokey because we're able to immerse ourselves in the story in spite of it. The Wizard of Oz and the original Star Wars trilogy come to mind as examples of Hollywood films that, though they were visually stunning and even revolutionary for their time, simply don't hold water to computer-generated special effects that we see in Hollywood movies today. Nonetheless, we still watch them because they capture our imagination and offer us a window into the time period in which they were made. In short, they're timeless classics. I think that in the West, at least in the United States, my country, we don't often look outside of Hollywood to find such timeless classics. Americans, and I think most Westerners, especially don't look to the Soviet Union expecting to find a spectacular film industry, which is a shame because they're missing out. In my opinion, some of the greatest films ever made were made in the Soviet Union. From its earliest days, the Soviet film industry was groundbreaking and technically marvelous. The silent films directed by Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein, such as Alexander Nevsky and the battleship Potemkin, were both technically revolutionary and highly entertaining. In my opinion, probably better than any American silent films from the same era. The 1966 Soviet film adaptation of Leo Tolstoy's novel War and Peace, directed by Sergei Bondarchuk, checks every single box, and it just might be my favorite film ever, from any country. However, I think it was in the 1980s that the Soviet film industry really peaked. Even as the society around them buckled under the weight of a collapsing economic system, Soviet people could still find solace in high-quality films. What they lacked in budget, they made up for in story, dialogue, and quality acting. There's one Soviet film I kept thinking of as I did the research for the topic I'm going to cover today. It's actually one that I found to be kind of unremarkable when I first watched it. But now, having a more complete understanding of the context of the period in which it was made, I'm beginning to think it's an absolute masterpiece. That is the 1986 film Courier. It tells the story of a sort of directionless teenage boy in Moscow struggling to find his place in a society that neither values nor understands him. I won't give you too many spoilers in case you want to go watch it. The studio that produced it, Mosfilm, has made it available for free with English subtitles on YouTube, and I highly recommend it. But there's one scene that is particularly memorable to me. In this scene, a group of youths about the same age as the film's protagonist, dressed in Western fashion, listening to Western music, are breakdancing in a park next to a row of Brezhnevky apartment buildings. From across the street, the breakdancers are observed by another young man who is also roughly their age, except rather than Western clothes, this young man is wearing a Red Army dress uniform. and carrying a suitcase. He bears a large scar on the side of his face. The visual is clearly meant to imply that this young man has just returned from the war in Afghanistan. He looks on with a face of bewilderment, sadness, and a little bit of resentment, unable to relate to his own generation or to the country he is coming home to. The breakdancers, I think, represent perestroika and the new Russia, while the young man in uniform represents the old Soviet Union. And this scene, to me, shows the increasing divide between those two increasingly incompatible concepts. The war in Afghanistan was the event that bridged the old Soviet Union to the new Russia. When the 40th Army first went into Afghanistan in December 1979, Soviets lived under the conservative backlash of Brezhnev, with a government that looked backwards to preserving the old ways of doing things. When they returned just over 9 years later, they returned to a country awash with the reforms of Gorbachev, perestroika, glasnost, and though they didn't yet know it, the impending collapse of the country itself. As one Soviet officer who served in Afghanistan put it amidst the Soviet withdrawal in February 1989, quote, "It's been a strange war. We went in when stagnation was at its peak, and now leave when truth is raging," end quote. When the Red Army invaded Afghanistan in 1979, few observers around the world thought that the Afghan rebels would last very long against them. Despite its obvious shortcomings in the arms race with its Western counterparts, the Red Army was among the largest, best-equipped militaries in the world. They rolled into Afghanistan with tanks, helicopters, armored personnel carriers, and every other kind of military equipment considered state-of-the-art in the late 1970s and early 1980s. One Red Army soldier who was taken prisoner by the Mujahideen in late 1980 later told an interviewer he was shocked to find that many of his captors were armed with the same flintlock muskets that had been used to repel the British Army a century earlier. And yet, these guerrillas, who came to be known by the Soviet soldiers as dukhi, a Russian word meaning spirits or ghosts, proved to be remarkably stubborn, resilient, and competent warriors. Numerous Soviet officers who served in Afghanistan expressed at least a grudging respect for the fighting skill and tactical savvy of their enemy. Depending on what part of Afghanistan they were in and which Mujahideen faction they were up against, there were numerous groups with very different ideologies. The relationship between Soviet officers and their enemies could be almost chivalrous. Ahmad Shah Massoud, for instance, the man who came to be known as the Lion of Panjshir, was renowned for treating prisoners humanely, regularly exchanging prisoners, and even negotiating periodic ceasefires with Soviet forces. At least one Russian who fell into his hands is known to have chosen to stay with him rather than be exchanged. He married an Afghan woman, converted to Islam, and eventually became a member of Massoud's personal bodyguard. On the other hand, Massoud's rival, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, earned a reputation for downright brutality. He was known to torture and summarily execute Soviet prisoners who fell into his hands. If they were lucky, he would kill them before he mutilated them. According to some accounts, few were that lucky. As time went on, these Mujahideen only became more effective as they received covert support, including training and modern weapons from the United States, the CIA being eager to weaken the Soviet Union and get revenge against them for their support for the anti-American insurgency in Vietnam. Soviet support for the Viet Cong insurgency in Vietnam was an open secret, and many in the United States held the Soviet Union squarely responsible for the death of 58,000 U.S. servicemen in Vietnam. Especially after the anti-communist crusader Ronald Reagan became president following his landslide victory in the 1980 U.S. election, the U.S. government enthusiastically supported the Mujahideen. Like Soviet support for the Viet Cong, American support for the Mujahideen was one of the most open secrets of the Cold War. As a Democratic congressman from Texas, Charlie Wilson, one of the biggest supporters of the Mujahideen in Washington, D.C., once put it, quote, "It's the Cold War. Everybody knows about it," end quote. All pretenses of neutrality were pretty much dropped in 1986, when certain Mujahideen factions found themselves suddenly and miraculously in possession of American-made surface-to-air anti-aircraft missiles. In short, the longer the war went on, the stronger the Mujahideen became. And in turn, the weaker the Soviets became, as they dealt with crisis after crisis at home and increasing disillusionment with the war, not just among Soviet civilians at home, but among the very soldiers who were expected to fight that war. Low morale was a constant problem for the Soviet troops in Afghanistan. Many struggled to understand, and the government had a hard time articulating to them why they were there even fighting this war. A Soviet journalist covering the war, Artyom Borovik, recounted a story he heard from a group of soldiers he interviewed in 1988. According to the story, one of their fellow soldiers had been really struggling with his mental health in the war, even contemplating suicide. Then, in what his comrades described as a stroke of good luck, he was wounded in a helicopter crash, suffering a severe blow to the head, which caused him to suffer from complete amnesia. His comrades took turns sitting with him and telling him the story of his life to help him remember. But he kept asking the same question. Why were they in Afghanistan? And none of his comrades were able to give him a satisfactory answer to that most basic of questions. Now, this story is likely apocryphal. If you read wartime accounts of combat soldiers, and I've read many, regardless of which war and in which time period, these kinds of stories are common. It probably didn't happen, but that doesn't necessarily mean it isn't true. It speaks to a larger truth. Many of the young men from the Soviet Union who risked their lives in Afghanistan struggled to understand why. As Napoleon Bonaparte once said, quote, "A man does not have himself killed for a halfpence a day or for a petty distinction. You must speak to the soul in order to electrify him." End quote. And the bureaucratic establishment of the Soviet Union failed to consistently speak to that soul. Why was a question they never expected to have to answer. They were coming off quick, successful, and relatively bloodless military interventions in the preceding decades in Hungary and Czechoslovakia to prop up or install Soviet-backed governments in those countries. The expectation was that the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan would be just that, a brief, victorious intervention. So if you're asking how the Soviet authorities expected to sell this war as worthwhile to the Soviet people, you're asking the wrong question. The Soviet politicians, Brezhnev and his ilk, who started the war, never intended for it to be a war, and never expected it would go on long enough for them to have to sell anything to anybody. In this, they completely failed to understand Afghanistan's people or its geography. It's not like there weren't people in the Soviet Union, including in the intelligence community, who knew better. In March 1979, the KGB's chief representative in Kabul, Leonid Bogdanov, told Soviet Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, quote, "There is no military solution in Afghanistan," end quote. He was ignored. For years, the Soviet government would attempt to hide that there was even a war in Afghanistan, their propaganda instead telling the people that their soldiers were on a mission of internationalism in Afghanistan. They didn't deny that there was fighting in Afghanistan, but maintained that it was the Afghan army that was doing the fighting. The Red Army was simply there to build schools and hospitals, supporting the people and freeing up more Afghan troops to go engage with the rebels, who in the official propaganda were referred to as counter-revolutionaries. Soldiers were forbidden from telling their families that they were engaged in combat in Afghanistan, and the press, still strictly censored, was forbidden to cover the combat operations taking place there. They were allowed to highlight the heroism of individual soldiers decorated for their service in Afghanistan, but the coverage was always vague, never describing with any specificity what they had done or why they were being decorated. Slowly, the truth began to leak back to the Soviet public. The censors could not prevent returning soldiers from telling the truth to their friends or family, nor could they hide entirely the thousands of young men returning home in zinc coffins. Then, in 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev enacted his new policy of glasnost, a Russian word roughly translating as openness or transparency. The new policy introduced freedom of speech and limited freedom of the press to the Soviet Union, and independent Soviet journalists were allowed to go to Afghanistan and freely report on the war for the first time. Suddenly, like a dam broke, the Soviet people were bombarded with an avalanche of information about their country's war in Afghanistan. They were confronted both with the hardships faced by their own soldiers, as well as those of the Afghan civilians, including the many atrocities against civilians committed by the Red Army in Afghanistan. Many Soviet people were not necessarily learning anything they didn't already know, but to know something is not necessarily the same as to be confronted with it and forced to reckon with it. I'm intentionally avoiding the trope of Rambo 3, in which all the Soviet soldiers in Afghanistan are painted as heartless monsters. They weren't. They were ordinary, complicated people, mostly young men in their late teens and early 20s. But it's impossible to talk about the Soviet war in Afghanistan without talking about the atrocities and war crimes committed by the Red Army. They're an inescapable and inexcusable part of the Soviet Union's 9-year war in Afghanistan. Partially, it was a simple matter of the increasingly frustrating situation the Soviet troops found themselves in. They were sent into Afghanistan in relatively small numbers. There were generally about 100 to 110,000 Soviet soldiers in Afghanistan at any given time during the war. Not nearly enough to effectively control Afghanistan's mountains and deserts, which is some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet Earth. By contrast, at the height of American military involvement in Vietnam in 1968, there had been well over 500,000 U.S. military personnel on the ground in that country. The war in Afghanistan, like the war in Vietnam, was a guerrilla war. Chairman Mao Zedong, the famous Chinese communist leader who waged a successful guerrilla struggle, once wrote that, quote, "The guerrilla must swim among the people like a fish swims in the sea. Without the support of the people, the guerrilla is like a fish out of water. He cannot survive." End quote. This was a concept that was well understood by the Soviets. Many of the senior Soviet commanders in Afghanistan were veterans of World War II, and they were intimately familiar with the guerrilla tactics the Soviet partisans had employed behind German lines in that war. So in some sectors, the Soviet commanders deliberately tried to suffocate the guerrillas by draining the sea. In short, they sought to depopulate villages in the mountains along the Pakistani border in order to rob the Mujahideen fighting there of their base of support. Millions of Afghan civilians were killed or forced to flee to refugee camps in Pakistan. By 1987, it's estimated that nearly 1/4 of Afghanistan's population was living abroad as refugees. A common story from the Soviet-Afghan War is that the Soviets would disguise landmines as children's toys so that small children would pick them up and have their limbs blown off. The sources I read differ on whether there is truth to these stories. The Soviets, of course, outright denied that this was done, and there is little evidence of such a tactic being employed, at least at an official command level. What is indisputably true is that the Soviets used a lot of landmines in Afghanistan, including what are called butterfly mines. Mines that were small and colorful that could be mistaken by a child for a toy, but that were not intended for that purpose. These butterfly mines were specifically designed to maim rather than kill their victims. The tactical purpose being that a wounded man is more of a burden to his comrades than a dead one. To this day, however, many Afghans swear that they witnessed children injured by mines intentionally disguised as children's toys. American journalist Jan Goodwin, who was embedded with a group of Mujahideen, also corroborates these accounts. So it seems likely that this did happen, but probably not on a large scale and not with the official approval of senior Soviet commanders. In other cases, atrocities were carried out officially, with full knowledge and under orders of senior Soviet officers. Artyom Borovik, in his book The Hidden War, recounts witnessing a Soviet lieutenant colonel threatened with court-martial by his superior officer after he refused orders to shoot women and children in retaliation for the death of a Soviet officer in the area a few days before. That superior officer, a colonel, would later attempt to justify giving this order by stating he believed that the Mujahideen fighters were attempting to infiltrate his lines by disguising themselves in women's veils. It's unclear whether this colonel ever faced any kind of justice for the atrocity committed under his orders, but I find it unlikely that he did. The Soviet army that fought in Afghanistan was remarkably young. Though they were led by a professional officer corps, most of the ordinary soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan were conscripts, young men directly out of high school performing their compulsory military service. The median age of a Red Army private serving in Afghanistan was 19. They came from every republic and region of the USSR, from the Baltics to Siberia, and everywhere in between. In contrast to a false stereotype that later arose in Russia that Muslims from the Central Asian republics were unwilling to fight against their fellow Muslims in Afghanistan, the residents of the Central Asian republics were actually proportionally the most likely to serve in and to be killed in Afghanistan. They were followed by Ukrainians, then Russians, Caucasians, and residents of the Baltic republics bringing up the rear as proportionally the least likely to be killed or wounded in Afghanistan. Few sons of elite party members served in Afghanistan. Like the Vietnam-era draft in America, there were ways for the privileged to have their service deferred, for their parents to pull strings to ensure they were not sent to Afghanistan, or to avoid military service altogether. They served for a period of 2 years, the first several months of which was usually spent in training. This was yet another of the struggles the Red Army faced in Afghanistan. One officer lamented that he spent the majority of his time trying to shape the young conscripts into competent soldiers, but by the time they had learned enough to be useful, their term of service was up, and he had to train a whole new batch of green recruits. While the Soviet soldiers were constantly being rotated home and replaced with green recruits, the same was not so for their adversaries. With each passing year, the Mujahideen became not only better equipped, but more experienced. By the late 1980s, many Mujahideen bands were elite forces of battle-hardened veterans. The journalist Artyom Borovik later said of Afghanistan that anybody who spent a long period of time there went through 4 phases. In the first phase, he was generally optimistic, telling himself that if only we can get a few thousand more men here, everything will be fine. The second phase consisted of a resignation that since they were already in this mess, they must fight their way out of it. A few thousand more men won't do. We need another army. The third phase, he said, was simpler, and he summed it up as, quote, "There is something desperately wrong here. What a mess," end quote. And in the fourth and final stage, the person said to themselves, quote, "We'd be wise to get the hell out of here, and the sooner the better," end quote. Low morale and combat stress, what might today be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, were common among the troops in Afghanistan. Soldiers dealt with stress in different ways. Some turned to religion or mysticism. Though such practices were discouraged at home, they were tolerated in Afghanistan. Even the most ardent communist rarely stood in judgment of a man wishing to turn to God while serving in combat. As it was with the American soldiers in Vietnam, drug use was relatively common among Red Army soldiers in Afghanistan. Officially, this was a serious crime. In practice, however, most officers turned a blind eye to what their men were doing when they weren't in combat. As with just about every problem faced by the Soviet Union during this period, corruption played a role. The Afghan drug traffickers made sure that enough high-ranking Red Army officers were getting a cut of the money from their trade that nobody had too much incentive to shut it down completely. Hashish and various forms of opiates were widely available to the soldiers in Afghanistan. Some soldiers even used drugs during active combat missions. One Ukrainian soldier later recalled, quote, "It's best to go into an operation stoned. You turn into an animal. If you drink vodka or dry alcohol that's diluted in water, you can still feel your whole body. But taking a drug is like anesthetizing your soul. You stop feeling altogether. Later, when you come back, you just collapse like a watch spring that needs to be rewound, and all your muscles ache. As long as you're in combat, however, you just get high and run around like a maniac." End quote. The same soldier went on to say, quote, "I lost myself over there. Lost myself." End quote. Whether they took drugs or not, and whether they expressed it in those terms, everybody who spent time in Afghanistan was changed. Artyom Borovik wrote after his first stint in Afghanistan, quote, "To understand the stages of a soldier's life in Afghanistan, you must also look back on the changes in his state of mind. A soldier will shed his old habits, old fears, and old memories, much as a turtle sheds his shell. But it seems to me that even the chemical composition of my cells has changed. I have a feeling that when I return home and have my blood analyzed, it will turn out to be different from the sample that was drawn 2 years ago." End quote. As it is for all soldiers in all wars, returning home was a struggle for Soviet veterans of the Afghan War. The experience of veterans returning to the Soviet Union from Afghanistan is in many ways similar to the experience of American veterans returning from Vietnam. If you haven't already noticed, there are a lot of parallels between these two wars. I'm not the first, nor will I be the last to point this out. I do sometimes wonder if the historical animosity between Russians and Americans springs from us in some ways being mirror images of one another. But that, I suppose, is a discussion for another day. Unlike their fathers and grandfathers who had fought in the Second World War, veterans of Afghanistan were not welcomed home as heroes. Early in the war, when the truth of combat operations in Afghanistan was still largely hidden from the public, most of them received no special recognition at all. After Glasnost, when images and accounts of the war became more widely known, veterans were often viewed with suspicion. Some would associate them with the atrocities committed by the Red Army in Afghanistan and keep their distance. Potential employers who had heard about the psychological problems faced by many veterans would sometimes be reluctant to hire them. Others, particularly from the younger generation, their peers, viewed them not with suspicion or animosity necessarily, but as something alien. Like I talked about in the beginning of the episode, the war in Afghanistan was a bridge to the old Soviet Union of Stalin and Brezhnev, and veterans returning from the war were a stark reminder of that past and how far the country still had to come. Almost universally, veterans who have talked about coming home expressed that they had difficulty relating to their friends and families, and even to the society they were coming home to. People were not usually openly hostile to them, and they weren't spit on, though there's actually very little evidence of that happening to returning Vietnam veterans either. But rather, they returned to a country that they could not relate to, and in which many people simply preferred to ignore the existence of the war, of which they were a glaring reminder. At first, because the government refused to officially acknowledge that there was a war in Afghanistan, they were not even officially recognized as veterans. They were not eligible for the types of benefits that were available to veterans of the Second World War, and unless they had been permanently disabled, they were not generally eligible for any benefits at all. Slowly, throughout the decade that followed the war, veterans organized themselves into advocacy organizations that pushed for their full recognition as veterans and all of the benefits that came with that. They eventually received them, although by the time they did, the hyperinflation of the 1990s had run roughshod over the former Soviet Union, and those benefits were worth significantly less than they once had been. After Putin's rise to power in Russia, his focus on Russian nationalism and militarism has led to significantly more recognition and honors bestowed upon Russian veterans of the Afghan War. Memorials have been dedicated to the fallen in Moscow and all over Russia. This recognition, however, has been mostly symbolic, and very little has been done that is of material benefit to the surviving veterans. Over the course of the Soviet Union's 9-year war in Afghanistan, approximately 600 to 650,000 Soviet soldiers served in Afghanistan. Somewhere between 35,000 and 50,000 of these soldiers would be wounded by enemy fire. The sources differ, of which approximately 10,000 became permanently disabled. Over 300 Soviet soldiers are still considered missing in action, and approximately 15,000 soldiers were killed in action. Most were conscripted young men in their late teens and early 20s. A good chunk were older officers, just over 100 were women, officially designated for non-combat roles in Afghanistan, but who nonetheless found themselves under enemy fire. All of them were somebody's son, husband, father, wife, daughter, or mother. Human beings whose lives had meaning. Individuals whose families and friends mourned them and still miss them. On February 15, 1989, Igor Lyachovich became the last Soviet soldier killed in Afghanistan. Struck in the neck by a sniper's bullet near the border with the Soviet Union as the last elements of the 40th Army's rear guard evacuated the country. The fighting would continue in Afghanistan for 2 more decades, but for the people of the Soviet Union, those who lived as well as those who did not, Lyachovich's death marked the end of their struggle in Afghanistan. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. I do have a programming announcement this week. I work very hard to get an episode out to you each week. A tremendous amount of research and many hours of work go into producing each episode. Right now, I'm working a full-time job and helping to raise my 14-month-old son. Lately, all of these responsibilities have been a major strain on my time, and it's been increasingly difficult to release episodes on time on a weekly basis. Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. This podcast is my passion, and there's nothing that's going to stop me from continuing to produce it. I will, however, be shifting the timing of my episodes. Temporarily, I will be releasing new episodes every other week rather than every week. This is a terribly difficult decision for me, but in the long run, I think it's for the best. It will allow me to do the thorough research that is necessary and continue to produce quality episodes without losing my sanity. As always, I want to extend a special thank you and shout out to my patrons and supporters who support the show with monthly donations through Spotify or Patreon. I could not do this without you. If you're not a supporter yet and you want to be, links to both Spotify and Patreon can be found on the show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. On that website, you will also find links to all of my streaming platforms, social media pages, and a list of my sources for this week's episode. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. If you haven't already, I encourage you to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating on whichever podcast platform you're listening on. It costs you nothing, and it really helps to promote this podcast in the almighty algorithm so that it can be introduced to new listeners. It also helps me out big time if you tell your friends about the show and encourage them to listen. To all of my listeners and supporters, your support means the world to me. I couldn't do this without you, and I will see you in 2 weeks. Next time, on the History Sphere, I will take a closer look at the Mujahideen, who they were, and how and why they fought. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.